The last time the Nebraska Cornhuskers and the Iowa Hawkeyes played in Memorial Stadium was in the year of our Lord 2021. Nebraska was 3-8. They had one of the best teams in the history of college football with a losing record, competing against every top 10 team they had faced, taking leads in several of those losses, and blowing out the three teams they managed to beat. On the other end was a Iowa Hawkeye team that had an inept offense, though not as bad as 2023's or 2022's, and a defense that wasn't exactly as good as last year's or this year's defense of Iowa's. Nebraska at one point was up 21-6. Caleb Shudak kicked a field goal, and then magic, or a Nebraska moment happened, and Nebraska fumbled away the game, got a punt blocked away to lose the game, whatever you want to call it. Nebraska was actually favored by FPI and by Vegas entering that matchup 2 years ago. And while FPI favors Iowa to win this matchup, spoiler alert for our matchup section of the video, but who cares? The Cornhuskers are favored by Vegas to win, and I don't know how I feel about it. Well, actually, I do. But before we get into that, please hit that big red subscribe button if you support Nebraska football, if you're a fan of Nebraska football, and you want to see Nebraska football return in part to its glory days. I don't think Nebraska has a strong likelihood of ever returning to a Tom Osborne-esque level of success, but they don't need to in order for Nebraska to be a respected program that can give its fan base what it truly deserves. And like this video, if you think Iowa is going to win this game, comment your thoughts, analysis, and prediction for this matchup down below. And check out my Patreon page via the link in the description and the link in the pinned comment. Potential power is something that, until further notice, is just being postponed. We're having a lot of issues working on it. It's taking longer than expected, but that's because we're really trying to make my power rankings more complex so that it can have a better output. It was over 50% against the spread, about 50 to 55% against the spread, and around 75% against the money line this season. It may be back in time for the college football playoff. Maybe it'll be back this week, although that's very doubtful, and maybe for championship week. But until further notice, it's just being postponed. I'm sorry that I've said for about a week or so that it would be back. There's just been some unexpected hiccups that have come in the way. But next year, it'll definitely be up for next year. There'll be a preseason potential power that you all can look at, and it's been accurate. In its first year, in its alpha stage, it's already been accurate against point spreads, accurate in predicting who's going to win, more so than spreads, which is more important because I primarily use it as a predicting machine, not a betting machine. If you want access to that, you can sign up as an All-American or Heisman patron. If you just want to support the channel, sign up as an all-conference member. It's just $5 a month, and you're going to be thanked at the end of the video because your support is never, ever expected, but it is always and forever will be appreciated. I'm mixed on how I feel about Nebraska being favored by odds makers to beat Iowa. And I think that they're favored to beat Iowa because the line opened up at about even. It either opened up at Iowa -1 or Nebraska -1, depending on who you ask. And Nebraska, I'm going to use something from Josh Pate here because I think this is very appropriate for a game like this. For Michigan and Ohio State, it looks like Ohio State's been peaking more throughout these past weeks than Michigan has, but Michigan's also finally playing real competition. They had a trap game in between Penn State and Ohio State, and being Maryland on the road, who led Ohio State, really, or tied with them for 3 quarters on the road. So I don't know if saying that Ohio State peaking in November and Michigan seemingly plateauing but still being good is an indicator that obviously Ohio State's going to roll in Ann Arbor and win. For this game, it's, I think, different. Nebraska is 0-3 in the month of November. 0-3. They have not won a November game yet. Iowa, meanwhile, has won every single November game possible in oftentimes the slimmest of margins, beating Northwestern 10-7, dominating Rutgers 22-0. I thought Rutgers was instead going to dominate that game, and beating Illinois 15-13, in which Iowa's kicker missed an extra point, rarity, and he missed a field goal, again, rarity, and they still won. And they clinched the Big Ten West Championship, locked up that spot, and they will appear in Indianapolis whether they win or lose this game. And I think the reason why Nebraska is favored, get to the point I was going to make about Josh Pate in a few seconds, is because people watch Iowa play, and there is just such little margin for error. And they haven't had to travel on the road since they played at Wisconsin. And they won that game, but that was by a slimmer margin than the 9-point margin of victory would suggest. And Lincoln, I think right now, is a tougher place to play in terms of crowd and noise and environment than Madison, Wisconsin is. Madison, Wisconsin just hosts the better team and better program, Wisconsin football, than does Memorial Stadium in Lincoln, Nebraska. Nebraska football. I think that Nebraska having a stout defense, decent special teams unit, an offense that yardage-wise I think is better at moving the football than Iowa, but they just fail to punch it in. Iowa's better at scoring touchdowns. They have the better passing offense. And it's a rivalry game where Nebraska won last year on the road. I think there's a lot of people who just look at Nebraska and also see that they're in desperation mode at 5-6, and that Nebraska, I think, is fighting for more than Iowa is. Iowa's already clinched up the Big Ten West. Unless they somehow win Indianapolis, they're not going to a New Year's Six Bowl. It's probably an unrealistic goal. Nebraska still has realistic goals in front of them as it pertains to the preseason. Iowa's most realistic goal is just winning this game and getting to 10 wins at this point. So I don't know exactly why Nebraska is a favorite. It's fascinating to me. I think it's bait. I think that people are laying, that Vegas is laying a trap for people. And if I predict in this video that I think Nebraska's going to win, do not use my prediction as a reason or a justification for you to put your money on Nebraska, because I've predicted Nebraska to win the previous 3 games, and I might predict them to win this game based off of circumstance, and I have been 0-3 in the month of November at picking Nebraska football. I have. Iowa, on the other hand, has proved me wrong. And something that Josh Pate, this is me finally getting to that point, something that he talked about in regards to November is when a team is trending up, when they are peaking, when they are doing well, and another team is just falling off the rails. Nebraska going 0-3 in the month of November, and I think at this point they could be mentally broken. Not checked out, but they could be broken or breaking. You oftentimes have to go with the team that is peaking. Even if there's a trap game, even if it's a tough road environment in a rivalry game, if there's a team that's peaking and a team that is imploding, by the time November rolls around, you are who you are, for the most part. Michigan, Ohio State's a great example of this. Whoever loses in the game will probably still be an elite football team. They are who they are right now. And whether Ohio State or Michigan is the better team or they have the better game, that will determine who wins in Ann Arbor. But they're both 11-0. They're guaranteed, obviously, 11 wins. The loser of the game, if they don't make the college football playoff, will probably win the New Year's Six Bowl game on virtue of how good they are right now. They're top 2 in FPI. You are who you are, at least by this late in November. Maybe not 2 or 3 weeks ago, but right now, 11/12ths of the regular season are over. And the entirety of the regular season will be over as the clock strikes midnight on Saturday, November 25th, and we enter Sunday, November 26th. Iowa's 9-2. Nebraska's 5-6. Iowa's 39th in FPI, Nebraska's 61st. Iowa's given a 60.6% chance to win. According to Football Power Index, the line should be 5 points more in favor of the Hawkeyes, factoring in home field advantage for the Huskers. Yet, Vegas line's favoring Nebraska minus 2.5. And comparing FPI to the Vegas line, comparing what the line should be, Potential Power would often set these massive point spreads. And a large part of the time, they'd come out to be correct. In some instances, for example, it'd favor a team to win by 40 points or 45 points. And they would win by that exact number or perhaps more. But Potential Power is more of a predictor machine, not necessarily an odds market machine. So when Potential Power produces a line or a number, that's Potential Power predicting how much this team is going to win by, with a margin of error, not much how they should be favored by. For FPI, FPI basically produces numbers of which teams would be favored over who on a neutral field and who would win more times than not against another team in a neutral field. FPI thinks that Iowa would win about 6 out of 10 times playing at Nebraska. They should be favored by around a field goal, but in turn, Nebraska instead is about the field goal favorite. And look, about 65% of public bets are on Nebraska to cover the spread, and over 80% of bets are on Nebraska money line. I don't like that. I don't, given how they've performed over the previous 3 weeks. It feels like, whether it's Nebraska fans or college football fans, it's the treatment of, well, we've been predicting that they're going to win for so long, we might as well keep doing the same thing. That's the definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And Nebraska's been this team where, whether it's Scott Frost in his later seasons or Nebraska right now, where because of that red N and because of the talent and also because of how they looked in the middle of the season, people expect this team to not just lay down and die. They expect them to win close games and to perform at a serviceable level. And I don't know if that's possible right now. Given what I watched against Wisconsin, Nebraska finally got good, competent quarterback play. It didn't work. Defense folded at times. Offense folded at times. Nebraska, as I mentioned in a video yesterday, they actually pivoted. Not in their present game plan, which would have been even worse, but I think maybe in terms of their identity. Against Maryland, you go full aggressive. You want to force the ball into the end zone. It's picked off. And against Wisconsin, you're driving down the field. And instead of trying to be aggressive and repeat that process, but now you have a better quarterback, better play calls, more experience, you know what and what not to do, you can learn. Instead, the Cornhuskers settle for the field goal. And that's understandable, but it's still a point where when a team pivots like that, sometimes I think that that's a show that they're not necessarily confident in their identity. But I could be wrong. I still think Nebraska has built a solid foundation. That's just something that I wanted to mention out there. About 2/3 of you on my community poll picked Iowa to win this game. It's about 1,055 of you. And 34% of you, about a third, picked Nebraska to win. It's around 545 of y'all. If you fellow football fanatics subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell and like this video, you will be nearly guaranteed to see my polls pop up in your feed, and you will get to vote. And your vote on, will Team A beat Team C, for example, will be included in this, where I show the results of the polls and show what my subscriber base feels about this game. It gives me a perspective into what my subscribers are thinking and also what the general public is feeling. The game will be played in Memorial Stadium, and home field advantage or not, I think it's clear that Iowa is the better team. Iowa is trending up. In a matchup that I am deeply concerned about on top of all of those things is trench play. Nebraska's offensive line, despite improvements compared to previous offensive lines, is still pretty bad, sometimes downright atrocious. Iowa's offensive line is an above average good unit, and it is facing off against what I think is a good to great Nebraska front six in their 3-3-5. Then again, Iowa's defensive line, I think, has a huge mismatch in both physicality and athleticism compared to Nebraska's offensive line. And Big Ten games, especially in the month of November, and really November college football games altogether, the trenches win. Georgia versus Alabama, big example, but here we go. In 2021, part of the reason why Alabama beat Georgia in Atlanta in the SEC championship game that season, that Georgia team went on to win the national title, was because that Alabama offensive line and defensive front played the best game they had all season long. And Alabama had the QB advantage, they had the wide receiver advantage, and Brian Robinson was just more of a consistent power back runner than James Cook and Zamir White. He could take a larger load and function at 100% or 90% or 80%, or in a way that still threatened opposing defense. Alabama won in the trenches. They gave Bryce Young time, and with a skill position advantage that was clear, especially after that game occurred, well, Alabama won, and they dominated because they led in the trenches. They led at skill position. They practically led everywhere in that game. And Iowa here, I think Nebraska has some advantages on the outside. I also think that Nebraska, now starting Chubba Purdy, has the better quarterback. I thought that Deacon Hill was a better quarterback than Heinrich Harburg and Jeff Sims because he was, funny enough, less turnover prone. And somehow Deacon Hill, as awful as he's been, has been more of an accurate passer than Jeff Sims and Heinrich Harburg. He doesn't turn over the football as much. He just is completely immobile and is really just a bad addition of Ben Roethlisberger. But to his own credit, he has been improving. Regardless of some of those advantages at skill position, I think Iowa has an edge in the trenches, an edge in overall defense, and they also have a returning presence at running back that's very threatening. Caleb Johnson had a long explosive touchdown of 30 yards against Illinois, so he is peaking. LaShawn Williams has been the best running back for Iowa this season. He is healthy. The offense of Iowa is improving week by week, and they're winning games. They're finding ways to win. Nebraska, I'd argue, is finding ways to lose games. They look very 2021, 2020, 2019-esque Cornhusker football. The past 3 weeks have reminded me a lot of Scott Frost teams where they are oh so close and yet oh so far. I'm not going to compare Matt Rule to Scott Frost. That's unfair. Matt Rule, I think, has already done a better job in year one than Scott Frost has done in about 4 or 4.5. Maybe that's a little too harsh, but I think close enough years of work. I think Matt Rule is the guy for Nebraska, and I like what he's doing. But Iowa right now is the more established program. They have the better coaching staff. Phil Parker's a better defensive coordinator than Tony White. Kirk Ferentz is a better and more proven head coach than Matt Rule, just is what it is. Marcus Satterfield, I think obviously better than Brian Ferentz, but you also have to factor in other position coaches, and Iowa's special teams coordinator, LeVar Woods, you have to take him. He's one of the best special teams coordinators in the country, and Iowa consistently knows how to nurture and develop offensive linemen. Tight ends, for example, Ostrenga, one of their many tight ends. They've unfortunately suffered from injuries. He is still doing good work. Addison Ostrenga. He has 116 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Iowa's leader in receiving yards is actually still Eric All, who has 299 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. And he has not been in action since October 14th against Wisconsin. It's been 5 weeks. 5 weeks since Eric All has been in game and he still leads the team in receiving yards. It's just absolutely bonkers. It is. Iowa does not pass the football. They pass it even less than they have last season. But their run game's decent. They've only averaged 3.4 yards per carry so far this season, but in their past few games, they have improved at running the football, especially against Rutgers and especially against Illinois. Against Rutgers, Iowa ran for 179 yards, averaging 3.9 yards per carry. And against the Illinois Fighting Illini, Iowa averaged 3.2 yards per carry with 114 rushing yards, and Caleb Johnson had a long touchdown run of 30 yards. Iowa has been out-rushing their opponents. Iowa has been controlling the clock. They had about 8-minute possession advantage over the Illinois Fighting Illini. And they don't turn over the football. Nebraska is very similar. See, this is how you know where a matchup could get ugly. This is a game where we're not even on to the players to watch yet. This could be a game that gets ugly for Nebraska. It could. I don't think it will. But Nebraska is Iowa. And Iowa is Nebraska. Except Iowa's much better. Nebraska is the mimic. They have a great defense, but not an elite defense. They have a substandard, mealy-mouth, gross, maggot-infested offense. Iowa does too, except theirs is slightly better, and they don't turn over the football. Nebraska is playing hot potato with the football, and they're gross, and they're smelly. Iowa is gross, they're smelly. You want to stay away from their offense, but their offense wants you to stay away from their football. They don't give it to you. And special teams-wise, elite special teams for Iowa, and on and off, but relatively good special teams for Nebraska. I give Nebraska credit, though. They have the better quarterback, I think, in Chubba Purdy. I think they have the better skill position talent, and this might be controversial, I like their defense better. Iowa, 20 sacks. Nebraska, they have close to 30 sacks on the season. They have 31, so in fact over 30. Both teams have over 700 total tackles. Both have over 40 passes defended. Nebraska has 15 forced turnovers on the season. If you only count recovered turnovers, then that's about 13. Iowa has only 12 recovered turnovers. So defensively, they are relatively similar. But when your offense in Nebraska is just giving the defense short fields to defend, it's painful. And Iowa football does also have a defense and a team that overall is more clutch. Look at the Illinois game, for example, and also the Minnesota game, even though they lost. Against Minnesota, that fair catch is called as a punt return for a touchdown. Iowa wins. With a few minutes left in the football game, Caleb Johnson runs it in for a touchdown on by far the team's longest run. Nebraska, meanwhile, gives up a game-winning field goal to Maryland after turning the football over in Maryland's end zone. And against Wisconsin, letting the Badgers get away with converting essentially every single third down that they would need to win that football game, whether in overtime or whether in regulation. So these teams are very similar but very different. Iowa only allows about 108 rushing yards per game. Nebraska allows 86.5. So the Cornhuskers have the better pass rush and better run defense. It's typically a good indicator that their defensive line is better. Iowa, I think, has the edge at safety. Even with Cooper DeJean being injured, I trust Sebastian Castro Quinn Schulte, Xavier Nwankpa, Jamari Harris, Deshaun Lee. There are a lot of players, plenty of them, even in the two deep, to like in the Iowa secondary. Nebraska's secondary isn't a joke either. Isaac Gifford, Omar Brown, Quentin Newsome, Fallon Sanford, Tommy Hill, who leads the team in interceptions with 3. Nebraska's a great secondary as well. I just think that they're a step behind. Linebacker is probably the biggest area where there's a disparity defensively. Iowa's leading tackler, 2 leading tacklers actually, are linebackers. Jay Higgins with 133 total tackles, a sack, 3 passes defended, a pick, and a forced fumble. Nick Jackson, 87 total tackles, 3 sacks, pass defended, 2 forced fumbles. Virginia transfer, preseason All-American, I think for me was honorable mention or third team, I believe. And I think Jay Higgins was on there at linebackers for me as well. Let me know in the comments below if you think I should do postseason all Big Ten awards or not. Those videos sometimes have been popular on this channel. Other times they haven't, but I could totally divest or invest, rather, resources into making that video if you want to see that. Special teams-wise, Tristan Alvano has been a solid kicker on the season. He is 8 of 13, long of 55. I do trust Drew Stevens, who's 17 of 23 with a long of 53, more though. Although, Stevens has missed an extra point. Missed it against Illinois, although I think it was blocked, so wasn't really his fault. Alvano's 26 of 26 on extra points. Offensively, and sorry for pausing here, this game, I'm pausing a lot because it's really hard to express thoughts on it, if I'm being honest, because these teams are so similar. For Nebraska, they're very repetitive in their losing ways. And Iowa's not fun to watch. Their game against Minnesota was fun to watch because I expected it to be very close, and it's a rivalry game. And it was also fun because Minnesota was making things interesting. Iowa's only fun to watch when it's a close game and they're down. They're not fun to watch when they're winning because then they're, well, quite frankly, boring. I mean, they only have 1,324 receiving yards on the season. That's less than Nebraska, whose passing offense is an atrocity. They have 1,442 receiving yards. Billy Kemp, the 4th, has nearly 300 receiving yards. Thomas Fidone, the 2nd, has 251 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. And I think he's better right now than Addison Ostrenga is. With Billy Kemp at wide receiver, I think the Huskers have the advantage at wide receiver. At running back, I love Emmett Johnson, like Darius Taylor at Minnesota. I think those are true freshmen, future studs. But LaShawn Williams and Caleb Johnson right now, they've combined for over 1,000 rushing yards, and they're averaging over 4 yards per carry. And they have 4 rushing touchdowns. So I think that Iowa has the edge at staff, running back, offensive line. Iowa this season has only allowed 23 sacks. Nebraska has allowed 27. And Iowa has passed the football on 30 more attempts. And they also played Penn State, who has one of the best pass rushes in all of college football. And I think Penn State sacked not Eric All, but I think they sacked Cade McNamara, like 6 or 5 times, something crazy like that. That was one of the worst Iowa football games in quite some time. So that's looking at the position advantages. My players to watch in this game are Sebastian Castro at defensive back and Chubba Purdy for Nebraska at quarterback. I look at Sebastian Castro because he's a phenomenal player, future NFL player. And with Cooper DeJean out, someone needs to step up in that defensive back room. And Sebastian Castro on the season leads the team in interceptions with 3. He has 7 passes deflected. He did have a pick 6. And he also has 48 total tackles. He's 5th on the team, 2nd in defensive backs behind Quinn Schulte in total tackles. Great player. That secondary, I think with Chubba Purdy, I think Nebraska's going to take some shots. I think that they're going to try and use Billy Kemp and Thomas Fidone. And I think that this will be, as much as it'll be a battle in the trenches and two teams trying to control TOP and run the football, it will be Deacon Hill and whatever he has, not much, trying to move the ball down the field, though they'll be more conservative than Nebraska. And for Nebraska's end, it will be Chubba Purdy and Thomas Fidone and Billy Kemp trying to move the football in the air, because both teams will want to run the football but also use the pass to keep these great rushing defenses honest. And I think the matchup to be had is Nebraska's passing offense versus Iowa's passing defense. And that right there, in a large sense, really leans toward where this prediction is going, does it? It would be the same thing if I told you that this game, what could determine it is Iowa's passing offense against Nebraska's secondary. The only hope that these offenses have in beating up the opposing defense is not through the air, because Iowa doesn't have the weapons. I mean, really, neither team has the weapons, but Iowa's even less weapons. And Nebraska's offense is facing one of the best secondaries in the country, and they have a worse scoring offense than Iowa does, which is fascinating. Nebraska, they have the 121st scoring offense. They score 18.2 points per game. 125th, correct me. Iowa scores 18.5. It's 123rd. Somehow Nebraska's a worse scoring offense. The only way these two teams can win is if they win at the lines of scrimmage. That would be a much more favorable matchup for Nebraska, is if I said that the game for them is winning in the trenches. But I don't think that that's going to happen. So I think they will have to settle for an option that's even more, to a certain degree, unfavorable, because they're going to have to get out of their comfort zone. Both teams will have to be patient if they want to win. I think Iowa is built more for the type of game that both are capable of playing, which is slow, frustrating, incompetent football. Classic November Big Ten football in the Big Ten West. And I pick Iowa to win. My faith in Nebraska for this season is wiped out. It is. And Iowa objectively is the better team. They have the better defense. They have the more consistent passing offense, at least in terms of the total season. I think Nebraska overall right now is the better passing offense. Nebraska has the better rushing offense, but at the same time, you have to factor in turnovers, and the defenses are about equal in forcing turnovers. Nebraska's offense, even with Chubba Purdy, gave up an interception there at the end, and they're very inconsistent, to say the least. I think the Hawkeyes will rush for over 100 yards and slowly wear down Nebraska's defense. I wouldn't be shocked if Nebraska, they gave up more than 100 yards rushing, because Iowa will have 40 rush attempts. So it won't be a ton of insane plays, maybe one or two big pops, but it will really be Iowa leaning on that Husker defense. And I don't think they'll be able to hold up forever, whether there's a turnover in a short field or Deacon Hill and Williams and Johnson put together a drive for Iowa. I don't exactly know. I think Iowa will win. I think Iowa will cover. They will win the field position battle. That's why I have them kicking an extra field goal to win. They have the more consistent special teams. Nebraska, they will outgain Iowa the same way they outgained Wisconsin, but they will lose 2 or more turnovers and fail to clutch up. I think Iowa's probably forcing a fumble, and I think with that secondary, I think they will pick off Chubba Purdy, whether that's on a final game-winning drive attempt that's a failure, or at some point else in the game. This will be another painful, close loss for Nebraska. And I wish it wasn't that way. I'm a Michigan fan, but I love the program of Nebraska, and I want them to win here, but my brain and my objectivity says they shouldn't be favored. Vegas is laying a bear trap with big, thick, diamond-dusted teeth that is going to rip the limbs off of whoever puts large sums of money on Nebraska to win. I mean, this is part of my reason why I'm picking Michigan to beat Ohio State. 80%. 80% of the total bets for money line and for money line for Nebraska, and about 60 for spread. 80% of the bets and 60% of the bets, whether it's money line or spread, are on the Huskers to win. And for Ohio State, Michigan, about 80% for both money line and spread is on Ohio State to win. When a large segment of the public is behind one team, and you see that the other team is objectively better and they have more matchup advantages, you go with that team. In the same way that Michigan has the overall better team, better depth, home field advantage, and they have some other on-the-field matchups, and that's why I'm picking them. I pick Iowa because they have the better coaching staff, they have better matchups on the field, and they're overall the better team, both offensively and defensively, by the most important statistic, which is scoring offense, scoring defense. And it's not always that simple as well. You got to look at sometimes points per play margin, yards per point. Iowa's extremely high in yards per point in scoring offense and yards per point margin, because yards per point margin more so measures the toughness. How tough is it for opponents to score on you, and how often do you score points? How tough is it for you to score points on opponents? And it's very tough for Iowa to score points on their opponents, but Iowa's defense might be the toughest defense to score on. And if they had an average or above average offense, I think we would view their defense, even this season, perhaps as the number one defense in the country. But their offense is so bad that it even taints their defensive performance, which is why Brian Ferentz just had to be let go. Because at this point, Iowa is now wasting their beautiful special teams and defensive talent with the offense that they put out on the field. Imagine if they had an offense that scored 24, 27, 28, 31 points per game with that defense. This team would be 11-1 right now. They would have competed with Penn State and Beaver Stadium to go 12-0. They could be in the college football playoff conversation if they had that offense, which sounds nuts to say, but it's true. It's absolutely true. So 13-10, Iowa wins in Memorial Stadium. They will go 10-2 in the regular season, play in Indianapolis. Nebraska will go 5-7 and miss a bowl game for the 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 for the 7th year in a row. Have a great day, guys, and thank you so much for those who are sponsoring the channel. Thanks to Crash2488, Anthony McDowell, and Justin Rogg for being Heisman patrons. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Snowwood DLC, and SFS Inverter for being All-American patrons. And thanks to Will Loftus, Gabriel Calendar, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Chris Lane, Austin Christmas, and Zubin Zah for being All-Conference patrons. Have a great day, guys. Happy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you all around. Bye-bye.